From Daniel chapter 1. And if you've got a Pew Bible, it is page 884, if you want to follow along. In the third year of the reign of Joachim, king of Judea, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord delivered Joachim, king of Judea, into his hands, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. These he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia and put in the treasure house of his God. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, chief of his court officials, to bring into the king's service some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility, young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. He was to teach them the language and the literature of the Babylonians. The king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. They were to be trained for 3 years, and after that, they were to enter the king's service. Among those who were chosen were some from Judea: Daniel, Hananiah, Meshach, and Azariah. The chief officials gave them new names. To Daniel, the name Belteshazzar; to Hananiah, Shadrach; to Meshach, and to Azariah, Abednego. Sorry about all these funny words, I can't pronounce them. But Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine. And he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself in this way. Now God had caused the officials to show favor and compassion to Daniel. But the officials told Daniel, "I am afraid of my lord the king, who has assigned you your food and drink. Why should he see you looking worse than the other young men of your age? The king would then have my head because of you." Daniel then said to the guard whom the chief officials had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Meshach, and Azariah, "Please test your servants for 10 days. Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then compare our appearance with that of the young men who eat the royal food, and treat your servant in accordance with what you see." So he agreed to this, and he tested them for 10 days. At the end of the 10 days, they looked healthier and better nourished than any of the young men who ate the royal food. So the guard took away their choice food and the wine they were to drink and gave them vegetables instead. To those 4 young men, God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning. And Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all kinds. At the end of the time set by the king to bring them into his service, the chief official presented them to Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them, and he found none equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Meshach, and Azariah. So they entered the king's service. In every matter of wisdom and understanding about what the king questioned them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in his whole kingdom. And Daniel remained there until the first year of King Cyrus.
Thanks so much, Abby. So many difficult names all in one passage. Right, let me just move this out of the way. Morning, everyone. My name is Matt, if we've not met before. Isn't it great to be together and great to be in the book of Daniel? We're going to be in the book of Daniel for the next few months, probably for the next 3 months. And I'm going to do the first 3 talks, and it's just been such fun preparing these talks. Daniel is such a wild ride. This book is amazing. It was written these events took place in 605 BC. So it was written about 80 years after that, so 2,500 years ago approximately. And it is as relevant today as it was back then. One of the main reasons that Daniel wrote this book is to help us see how God's people should relate to the culture around them. I like that classic story about the 2 young fish. Have you heard this? There's 2 young fish and they're swimming along, and then an older fish swims by them and he says, "Morning, boys, how's the water?" And then the 2 young fish swim on a bit confused, and then one of them turns to the other one and says, "What is water?" And that's a clever story because that's a little illustration of what we're like with the culture around us, isn't it? So often, the culture around us, we're so saturated in it that we can't even see it. You know, it's every article that we read, every Instagram post, every HR policy. We're swimming in it and we can't see it because it's our everyday life. And that matters for us if we're Christians, because we are fooling ourselves if we think that our culture is neutral when it comes to Christian things. It's not neutral. Our culture is pushing in a particular direction. It's like a river flowing. And so if you're a Christian today, one of the key questions that we need to be asking ourselves, examining our hearts and asking is, well, am I just going along with the flow of the river? Have I accepted what the culture says about how I should be making decisions about my life? Or am I living in accordance with what Jesus has said? Am I pushing in the direction of culture, or am I pushing in the direction of Christ? Okay, before we get into the text, I'm going to pray. I'm going to pray using some words from chapter 2 of Daniel. So let's pray together. God of heaven, we praise your name. Wisdom and power are yours. You change times and seasons. You depose kings and raise up kings. Your dominion is an eternal dominion. Your kingdom endures forever. You give wisdom to the wise and knowledge to the discerning. So, Lord, please, as we read these words, fill us with wisdom that we might live for you. Amen. Okay, let's set our scene. At the beginning of this book, Daniel and his 3 friends, they're young. They're probably 13, 14 years old. They're in their early teens, and they are part of the Jewish nobility. So within Jerusalem, they are part of the extended royal family. We know that they're smart. We know that they're handsome. We know that they're quick to learn. But one day, Daniel's life is turned upside down because Babylon comes knocking at the door. Verse 1, in the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. Now, if we're not that familiar with the Bible, this is what we need to know. Babylon is a bit like the opposite of God's kingdom. So from the beginning of the Bible, Genesis 11, Babylon is founded where the Tower of Babel was. And throughout the whole Bible, from the rest of the Bible, Babylon is like a picture of an anti-God place. It's like a geographic representation of rebellion against God. That's how Daniel and his friends would have understood Babylon. That's what they would have thought it was. It's an anti-God place. It's a place of rebellion against God. And one day, when Daniel's in his early teens, Babylon, the king of Babylon, turns up in Jerusalem and they take from Jerusalem some of the articles from the temple, some of the important things from the temple, and they take them back to the city in Babylon. That's going to be important in a few weeks. But crucially for us this morning, they also take some people, almost in a kind of hostage situation. They take some of the nobility, and then they start them marching. So imagine you're in Daniel's position, you're 13, 14 years old. Babylon, the king of Babylon, comes, takes the stuff from the temple, and he takes you and your friends and makes you march. And you're under armed guard, and you march and march and march. You're young. Imagine the trauma of that. Imagine the fear of that. And you march, and the days turn into weeks, and the weeks turn into months. And after 3 months of walking, you start to see the city on the horizon. As they approach the city, they realize that this place is bigger than they've anticipated. As they see it coming closer and closer, they see the largest city on the planet. According to Herodotus, who apparently, take it with a pinch of salt, he was prone to exaggerate, but according to Herodotus, the walls of the city were 100 meters tall and 25 meters thick. This place was vast. It was huge. It was the most architecturally advanced city anywhere. As they approached, they would have walked under the Ishtar Gate, and this is a replica of the Ishtar Gate in a museum in Berlin, covered with these blue ceramic tiles and these images of animals that represent different Babylonian gods. As they walked under that gate, they would have then saw the Great Processional Way. This is a street that ran from one end of the city to the other, and the river Euphrates ran alongside it. It was 20 meters wide, this street. They would have walked down it, and on the right and the left, they would have seen palaces. They would have seen the hanging gardens of Babylon. They would have seen temples. There were 1,000 temples in this city. It was incredible. There was nowhere else on earth that was like this. It was amazing. It would have surpassed all other cities. And I think that's important to say, to realize that Daniel and his friends, they would have been surprised by this place because they knew this place is full of idolatry. This place is an anti-God, a place of rebellion against God. And yet, look at it. It's amazing. And I think that's important because I think sometimes we look at our culture and we think the same thing. We think, wow, this is amazing. There's something alluring about this. Okay, so imagine Daniel and his friends. They've been asking themselves, what are we doing here? Why are we marching? We've arrived. Now what do they want from us? They're taken step by step through the city until they arrive at some sort of university. And so, what is this? Is this some kind of act of charity from Babylon for these poor people that have been ripped out of Judah? Is this a kind of a program for the exiles? What are they doing here? Well, the Babylonians have a plan for them. They have a plan for Daniel and his friends. Let's read from verse 3. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, chief of his court officials, to bring into the king's service some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility, young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. He was to teach them the language and literature of the Babylonians. The king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. They were to be trained for 3 years and enter the king's service. Okay, what's the Babylonian plan? What do they want? Assimilation. The Babylonian plan is to bring the brightest minds from all across its empire, from Jerusalem, take them out of Jerusalem, and turn them into Babylonians. And the best of the best, they get to stay in Babylon and work for the civil service. And the others, they get to go into other places in the empire, sent back to their place where they came from, as Babylonians. Their plan is to make Daniel and his friends Babylonians, take them out of Jerusalem and take the Jerusalem out of them. Look at verse 7. How are they going to do this? That's the question. How are they going to do this? Verse 7. The chief official gave them new names. To Daniel, the name Belteshazzar. To Hananiah, Shadrach, Mishael, Meshach. And to Azariah, Abednego. This is the first step of assimilation. Change their names. Now you might be thinking, well, that's not a big deal. When you go to a new country, a new culture, lots of people change their names. We've seen that. Lots of our friends from other places in the world here today, they've come to the UK and they've changed their names. Why is that a big deal to change your name? Well, it's not just because their names might have been slightly difficult to pronounce. It's part of this assimilation plan. And we can tell that when we look at their names a bit more closely. It's easy to miss this, but the names get changed and the meanings get changed. So Daniel's name, Daniel in Hebrew, means this: God is my judge. And his name gets changed to Belteshazzar. Now Bel, it's a short version of the Babylonian god Marduk. So Belteshazzar means Bel protects his life. So you see, it's not just that they're changing their names because their names become easier to pronounce. They're changing their names because it's part of their plan to change them into Babylonians. Now, your name is important, isn't it? It's the core of your identity. So Daniel, his name is God is my judge. That's what he's called. That's what his parents named him. And Babylon has said, no, now your name is Bel. Our God protects your life. Let's look at the others. Azariah, God has helped, becomes Abednego, servant of Nabu. That was the son of Marduk, and so another Babylonian god. Hananiah, the Lord has been gracious, becomes Shadrach, I fear Aku. So that was the Babylonian moon god. And this one, the last one, is the one that's particularly striking because the names are so similar, so they've sort of managed to really do a good job with Mishael, whose name meant who is like God. His name becomes Meshach, who is like Aku. It's really obvious in that last one, isn't it, what they're doing. Aku was this Babylonian moon god. So the Babylonian ambition is clear. Take Daniel away from his people and his God, and take his God out of him. And the first step of that is to change their identity. Change their names. But here's something to look for as we read the rest of the book. How does Daniel refer to himself? Now we're going to see this over and over again, but just as an example, just jump forward to chapter 5, verse 12. Don't worry too much about the context, but this is about 50 years afterwards. So this is a long time after chapter 1. Daniel has been in Babylon most of his life. And if you look at verse 12 of chapter 5, this is the queen of or the ex-queen of Babylon speaking about Daniel. So this is Nebuchadnezzar's wife. Nebuchadnezzar has now died, I think, at this point, and this is way after the new king is in place. And Nebuchadnezzar's wife is now talking to this new king about Daniel, and she says this, so end of verse 11, your father, King Nebuchadnezzar, appointed him to the chief of magicians, enchanters, astrologers, and diviners. He did this because Daniel, whom the king called Belteshazzar. Isn't that interesting? Daniel, who the king called Belteshazzar. So we're going to see this over and over again in this book. People don't refer to Daniel as Belteshazzar, while the king does. But lots of other people, lots of Babylonians, refer to him as Daniel. Isn't that interesting? Daniel doesn't take on his new name. He doesn't use his, sure, other people might use his, Nebuchadnezzar might call him Belteshazzar, sure. But Daniel, when he introduces himself to someone, he calls himself Daniel. Because that's his identity. Because that means God is my judge. Daniel kept his name. He didn't forget who he was. And so right up front in chapter 1 of Daniel, we're asked a question: do you know who you are? Do you know who you are? Or do you listen to what culture says about you and your identity? So if you're a Christian today, do you know that you are one of God's precious children? You're made in his image. You're created for him. You're set apart to do good works, to declare the glories of his name. You are precious to him. That's you. That's your identity. It's the same as Daniel's identity. If you're one of God's people, that's who you are. That's where your value comes from. Now, our culture tells us our identity and our value comes from our wealth or our job, our class, our social status, our Instagram account. And Daniel says to us, no. That's not what defines you. That's not who you are if you're one of God's people. Whether you're white or black, whether you've got lots of Instagram followers or not, whether you're upper class, lower class, a CEO, a cleaner, a marathon runner, or riddled with disease, those things don't define you. Don't let culture tell you that those things define you. They're not who you are. If you're a Christian, your identity, what defines you, comes from God. It comes from what he says you are, and he says you're precious. Okay, back to chapter 1. Let's read from verse 5, because what we're going to see is if the first step was changing their names, which isn't very subtle, especially when they changed them like as they did, the second step is slightly more nuanced. So verse 5, chapter 1, verse 5, the king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. So as part of their place at this university, not only are Daniel and his friends going to be taught the language and literature of the Babylonians, they're going to be taught presumably other things too, engineering and history and mathematics, but actually they get to eat from the king's table. Now, Nebuchadnezzar, we're going to meet him properly next week. We're going to come to understand what he was like next week. But the thing that we need to know here is he was the most powerful man in the world by far. He was the wealthiest man in the world by far. And so we can assume that he had pretty good food. This was incredible food. This was the best food in the world. This was food bought from all across the empire, so Nebuchadnezzar the king could enjoy it. This is the type of food that you need to eat if you want to be strong and healthy. And yet, verse 8, Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine, and he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself in this way. So this incredible food is on offer, and Daniel and his friends choose not to eat it. And they go to this guy, the guy in charge, and they say, we can't eat this. And the man in charge in verse 9, although he feels favor towards Daniel because of God, he's scared of the king, and he says, no, you need to eat this food. Sorry, no can do. And so Daniel, actually, he then goes back and he says to someone else this time, he says, look, we really don't want to eat this food. We want to do a test. I know that you think what we need is to eat all the food and be strong, and that's going to make us stronger if we eat all this food, but we can't eat it. Let's do a test instead. Just give us vegetables. Give us just, something like broccoli and beans, and that'll be fine. And this second servant says, okay. And Daniel says, look, just treat us in accordance with what you see. Just wait and see what happens for 10 days. So Daniel, he's very polite. He calls him, he says that he's a servant. He says, please. And he's reasonable. He says, look, just give us 10 days and treat us in accordance with what you see. So presumably that means if after 10 days they look really weak and sickly, then Daniel would have eaten the food, presumably. But anyway, this official, this junior official, he's like, okay, this seems like a good idea. Let's do this. Let's do a test. Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah, you guys, you eat vegetables for 10 days. And verse 15, what happens? They looked healthier and better nourished than any of the young men who ate the royal food. So the guard took away their choice food and wine, and they were given vegetables instead. All the vegetarians among us are like, see? I told you so. It's probably best not to get too bogged down in the dietary details. The thing that's important is in verse 15, when it says they looked healthier and better nourished, that better nourished phrase means fatter. That's what that means in the original language in Hebrew. So Daniel and his friends, they just eat vegetables for 10 days, and they get fatter than all these other guys who are eating mountains of meat and Krispy Kreme donuts. You know, that is interesting, isn't it? And we know that that's because God was behind that. It was God who made that happen. And that's interesting. You might be thinking, okay, well, why is that important? And I guess the question is, well, why don't they eat the food? Why do they want vegetables rather than what's on offer from the king's table? And I think there's probably three potential reasons, or two, that kind of form to make a third reason. So the first reason is the Levitical food laws, which lots of us will be familiar with. Daniel, he loved the Bible. We see that later in the book. He spends his time reading the Bible. And so he would have known the law. He would have known it really well. And the law of Leviticus required that food, particularly meat, be prepared in a certain way, and that some food was off limits. And that was a really important part of your identity if you were an ancient Jew. It's still an important part of your identity if you're a Jew today. You weren't allowed to eat certain things. And so some of the things on the table in front of Daniel, this feast that he's put on, some of those would have been sort of quite offensive to him almost. And he would have looked at them and seen them as unclean, things that would have made him unclean had he eaten them. So that would have been quite a visceral reaction, I think. So I think that's a big part of what's going on. Although the one thing that's sort of a question mark over that is that they include the wine. They don't want to drink the wine from the king's table. And there weren't specific laws about wine in the law. So that's interesting. So, okay, well, maybe it's another reason. So the second reason it could probably be is that it had been dedicated, this food had been dedicated to Babylonian gods. So we're going to see that happen in a couple of chapters' time. All the food that was in front of them had probably at some point been either offered as a sacrifice to a Babylonian god or sort of dedicated in some way to a Babylonian god. And so they would have felt, oh, well, I don't want to eat that if that's been used as a sacrifice to a Babylonian god. That might feel sort of very difficult for them. Although the one thing that's slightly odd about that is that we know that the vegetables too would probably have been used as some sort of sacrifice to a Babylonian god, and they're happy to eat the vegetables. So maybe it's not entirely that. But I think those two reasons together, the food laws from Leviticus and the fact that they'd been dedicated to a Babylonian god, probably come together to form a third reason, which is that it's an acceptable way of separating culturally from Babylon. Now, I lived in France for a few years in my early 20s, which was great, and I remember this time in France, I'd been there like 2 weeks, and this French guy, I was talking to him, and I felt a bit embarrassed because basically he was sort of saying, oh, you're English, so, what's your favorite food? And I was like, well, I'm a pretty simple guy. I really just like steak, big piece of steak, put it on the barbecue for 2 minutes each side. That's as good as it gets for me. And this French guy seemed to think actually that there was better food in existence than steak on a barbecue, which he wasn't shy about telling me. It was a great few years. I really loved my time in France, and I ate lots and lots of French food, and I ate lots of very tasty French food. And it would have been weird, wouldn't it, if during my time in France, I had said to my French friends and the French people at my church when they invited me around for dinner, I really appreciate that you're like French and you think food is a really big deal, but actually I'm British, and so I don't want to eat your French food. I only want to eat British food. That would have been quite a big deal. That would have been particularly a big deal in France, but probably a big deal anywhere to say, oh, no, I get it, I know you're French, but I'm British, and so I only want to eat British food. I only want to eat shepherd's pie, classically, culturally British dishes, like chicken tikka masala, like something really British. Like, I don't want to eat your French food. That would be weird. It would be offensive, because food is such an important part of culture. It's such an important part of your identity. It's what you consume, and it's what sustains you. And I wonder if there's something going on here where Daniel and his friends are saying, look, we get it. You've taken us out of Jerusalem by force. You can make us study your stuff, your literature. You can make us wear Babylonian clothes. We can be part of the Babylonian civil service. We can't actually control those things. But we are not Babylonian. We are not Babylonian. We will not eat your food. We will not call ourselves by the names that you give us. This is where we draw our line. And they do it with, they're polite. They say please and thank you. They're gentle with their Babylonian masters. They're gracious with them. But they draw their line and they say, no, this is our line. We're not Babylonian. And this is supposed to be a pattern for us. If we're one of God's people, if we're a Christian today, this is a pattern for all of us. I am one of God's people. God is my king. You can pick me up and you can put me anywhere in the world. It doesn't matter if I'm in North Bristol or North Korea or North Africa. God is my king. And so wherever I live, I follow his ways. And if his ways, they don't align with the way of the culture, then his ways come first, because God is my king. It's true, Daniel, he does adopt some Babylonian practices. He speaks their language. He becomes a civil servant in the Babylonian civil service. But when the direction of the Babylonian culture separates from the direction of his God, he always chooses his God. And if the values of the culture in which we live, or the practices or the laws, if they conflict with the law of Jesus, with the values of our king, then we are to obey our king. We are to obey Jesus. Even if it's costly, we draw our lines. And if you look around in our church family, that's what a lot of our church family does. And that's what is so encouraging to see that. I think of a particular brother from our church family who, in his workplace, there were vulnerable people who were being encouraged towards a lifestyle that would be harmful for them. And so he went to his boss and he just said, look, I can't do that. I can't encourage these vulnerable people towards that lifestyle because it's going to be harmful for them. Or I know several stories of different individuals in church who have a radically countercultural attitude towards money. I know one couple who they had a financial issue, they were in financial need, and this other couple just said to them, look, we'll give you the money you need. No strings attached, we'll give you the money. We've actually been saving for this purpose, trusting that the Lord, praying, asking him to give us an opportunity to serve some of our church family. Or the individuals in our church family who prioritize Sunday, no matter what. Sunday is a day of rest. It's a day to be with the Lord and his people. And so that means no sport on Sunday if it conflicts with that. It means no work on Sunday. That's countercultural. That is really unusual in our culture. And so there are loads of examples in our church family where people have drawn the lines and said, no, this is how I live. Jesus is my king. Even though that's going to be weird, there's going to be moments where that's going to be costly. Jesus is my king. So this chapter should be an encouragement to us, but I think it should also be a challenge to us. For me, maybe for you, there are areas in your life, in your heart, where you look around at the culture and, like Daniel walking into the city, you think, wow, this is great. This is amazing. This is alluring. For me personally, it's so often our culture's priority on comfort. You know, our culture says, prioritize what's comfortable. Make sure your kids are comfortable no matter what. Make sure you've got your financial cushion in place. Give your kids things that make them happy and comfortable. Spend your money on, the stuff of this world. That's where I feel so often the call of our culture on my heart. Prioritize comfort and security. And as I've been reading Daniel 1, I have really strongly felt the Lord say, that shouldn't be your priority. Of course, there's nothing wrong with being comfortable. Of course, there's nothing wrong with being comfortable. There's nothing wrong with having lovely things. Of course. But that shouldn't be your priority. If you're a Christian, your priority should be the Lord and his kingdom. So make your life about that. Make your life about the kingdom, not about the things of this world. Don't make these things your priority. Make Jesus your priority. It will actually, the Lord says, it will actually bring you more joy if you do that. And what I think we need to do in small groups tonight and tomorrow night is to reflect on this and to spend time praying about this, trying to discern where is it for us that actually the culture is saying something to us and we've gone along with it. We've just been swept up by it and taken along with it. We've accepted it. And where is it that Jesus is calling us to say, no, follow my ways. They're better. They will bring you life. I'm going to pray in a second if the band want to come up. But we're going to sing a song next. And this song is about our relationship with the world. Its opening line is, take the world, but give me Jesus. All its joys are but a name, but his love abides forever through eternal years the same. So we're going to sing that, and that's a call for us, isn't it? Take the world, but give me Jesus. Whatever this culture says, give me Jesus. So if the band want to come up, I'll pray and then we'll sing. Father in heaven, thank you for Daniel and thank you for the example that he is to live for you, even when it's costly, even when our culture says something that is against what you say, to live for you. And Lord, I pray that you would do a work in us so that we would follow his example. So that regardless of whatever our culture says around us, we would listen to you and we would follow our King, knowing that our identity comes from him. We are precious in your eyes. Lord, please help us to do that, we pray. Amen.